Looks like we're at 7 o'clock. So we're going to start our evening with our workshop here at 7. We're going to take that until 7:30, at which time we'll go into our regular agenda. On our workshop for this evening, we're going to cover two things. This is the wrong pad. Excuse me. So we're gonna talk about both a local law in front of us from the City Council, as well as a draft law around parking standards. Right, John? Yeah. So with that, I'll have you lead us through that conversation.
Do you want to cover the first one?
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I'll take care of the subdivision one, the referral local law. So you have on your agenda tonight a local law that was referred from the City Council. This amends Section 223-25C of the existing zoning code. And this comes as a request. You should have in your packets a letter from Cuddy and Fader dated October 11th on behalf of Seacon Beacon Developments LLC. That's the LLC for the Edgewater project. And what the request is to modify the existing provisions of the zoning code, which permit what we're calling sort of an internal subdivision, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, for residential properties in addition to commercial. Currently, our code permits it for commercial properties, does not permit it for residential. Now, what is it? So this internal subdivision process. We actually went through an application involving this particular provision of the code a couple years ago in 2020 for hip lofts for building 16. That's the building that originally they were going to sort of refurbish. It turns out it was too structurally unsound to save. They ended up tearing it down and rebuilding it. And for financing purposes, they came before the board to get what we're calling this internal subdivision, meaning the building itself is on its own lot. So usually the reason why developers will go through this process is mainly for financing purposes. When you have construction loans versus long-term financing, sometimes it makes sense to have certain buildings on separate lots so that they can be subject to different financing at different times during the project. So fast forward, Scenic Beacon Developments LLC has asked the City Council to change the current code so that that's not just applicable to commercial projects, but also applicable to residential projects like Edgewater, where we have one lot that has multiple buildings on the lot. And that way they can separate their financing, separate their construction financing from their long-term financing in order to help make the project more viable in today's crazy interest rate environment. So that's the purpose of the local law. You can see from the draft that was referred to you, there really are some pretty minor revisions to the existing language. You'll see in 223-25C, it really just adds to the term non-residential, adds residential or mixed-use projects and carries that throughout. Clarifies that it applies not just when you are doing a two-phased site plan, which frankly this board, ever since I've been sitting with the board since 2010, I don't think you've ever done a two-phased site plan for a commercial project, but it clarifies that you can implement this provision not just in that process, but also subsequent to a single-phase site plan review, which is typically the manner in which you review your site plans. So that's sort of the purpose of the local law and the revisions that are being proposed. The City Council did refer it to you for your comments. They have a public hearing scheduled for, I know I have the document here, for November 27th. So ideally, I think the City Council is looking for your comments tonight. on the proposed local law.
Great, thanks, Jennifer.
You're
So
welcome.
just to sum up, it's to simply take the bulk of the existing law and modify it to include residential or mixed-use projects, right?
Yeah, and I should have also mentioned an important part of this, that's part of the existing law and will remain as part of the law, is that the site itself, for zoning purposes and for the purposes of the site plan approval that's issued, is still treated as a whole. So it's
Single
not.
review.
Yeah, so
Yep.
you're not applying like different setbacks to the individual parcels. All of the conditions of the original approval remain for the whole site, including, these internal lots.
So the plat then, though, would represent those individual lots, right?
It would,
So
yeah.
we would need to look for those, right? And at least that becomes a part of the record.
It does,
Yep.
yep. In addition to, easements that might be necessary between the lots for utilities and any other common infrastructure or common features for the project.
So
Is-
it's an actual realty subdivision that's actually occurring, or?
I believe it's a non-real, so when we did this in 2020 for Hip Lofts, the County Department of Health did stamp the plat that was filed in the Dutchess County Clerk's office, and the stamp that they used was their non-realty subdivision stamp. So
I see.
they have two different kinds of approvals that they issue, one where you're requesting water and sewer connections, and one where it's a non-realty subdivision under the New York State Public Health Law.
So could, in the future, this separate building within the larger site be sold separately from everything else in the site?
Theoretically, I guess, like the financing, say they defaulted on the financing for the one lot, theoretically, the bank could take over that property, and it could be sold individually. However, it's still subject to the overall site plan approval, the overall resolution, the overall conditions, and all of those cross easements and maintenance agreements for any common infrastructure.
So, for
So
example,
the obligations
if,
still remain regardless of who the owner is.
say, I think it was in the instance of Hip Lofts, you create somewhat of an island lot, if you will, and obviously easements are important in that case.
Right.
In that example you just gave, the bank could take back that one particular part of the lot that they refinanced and dispose of it, right,
Right.
through sale.
Right.
So yeah, it sounds like it could get a little bit messy.
It could, and John Russo raised a really good question earlier today, and that was, well, what about when you have water and sewer infrastructure crossing
Yeah.
separate lots? And we know that, Dutchess County Department of Health doesn't permit, common infrastructure to cross over over lots when it's serving more than one lot. And I think that the answer there is that's why the applicant had originally requested that this be a building department approval process. Currently, it's a planning board approval process. Any applicant seeking to utilize this provision has to come to you for approval, and all of those questions and issues would be vetted at that time. The answer in some circumstances might be no, might be,
Sure.
no, or you need to first do a transportation corporation, or do some modifications to the utilities. So I think that all of these are really good questions. I don't know that we have the answers
Yeah.
to each and every one of them. It might be something that needs to be addressed kind of on a case-by-case basis as an applicant comes before you.
Yeah, I think as
And-
long as there is a mechanism for
Yeah.
that through that review process, right?
And practically speaking, the one that we did in 2020 was the only one that I've seen since 2010. So it's not something that people are,
It's not very common. Yeah.
knocking down the doors trying to
Well,
utilize.
To some degree, the developer, the owner, they've got to understand the complexities to a greater degree, right?
Right.
If they're imposing this on themselves, right? If they're
Right.
electing to implement this on their site, there are a number of complexities, and there's also the chance, though, that as they go under review, that the logistics and good planning just fly in the face of what they're looking to try to do, right?
Right.
So, sorry, did you have something?
Well, yeah, a couple things. I mean, just preliminarily, your reference at the beginning of the of what you were saying to interest rates and financing likely have a fair amount to do with why we haven't really seen this invoked too much in recent years. Frankly, I had a couple questions going in a couple different directions, but first of all, what is the actual history of this provision? In the code, what I could see is this subpart 22325 has been amended, I think 3 times in 1993 and once again in 2003. Did we start out with the 2-phase approval process in place, or was this something that was added later on? And how did we get to a point where the 2-phase approval process only applies to non-residential buildings in the first place?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to.
Okay,
I don't have the
using that
legislative
language, it would
history.
seem that
Yeah.
somebody intentionally drew a line, and so the question is, why?
Yeah, I don't know. But that's a good question, and one that, we can raise with the city council in your comments back, that, they should explore what the history of the, original adoption of this provision was.
Okay, the second thing I had, which
understand
is going in a somewhat different direction, and I'll apologize. I guess I'll apologize for being a lawyer, but one of the revisions in this that we haven't talked about, it completely threw me for a loop. And so this subpart C is what governs these, 2-phase lot approvals, and within that, there's a subpart 3. And the first amendment has to do with what we've been talking about, conforming language to go along with that. The second thing is striking this language. Okay, the only way this makes sense is if I read the language that's there now and then say what's being taken out. So what it's saying is that once the first phase of approval has been granted in sum and substance, the applicant can subdivide the lot. It says the standards as referred to in subpart D, which is the basic subpart governing planning board approval in the first place, shall apply to the overall site area whether or not the same is or will continue to be under one ownership, so long as all of such land is contiguous with the exception of any streets or driveways. And what's being struck is so long as all of such land is contiguous. And what is the intention of doing that?
Yeah, I was going to ask the very same question.
Yeah, I wasn't part of the drafting of that particular provision, or the revisions, I should say. However, I think that what the intent is that to kind of streamline the language a little more. So it shall apply the standards referred to in 223-17D. So all of your dimensional zoning standards shall continue to apply to the overall site area, whether or not it's still under one ownership. So
Right.
that goes to the question that we were just talking about. What if the bank defaults and the
One
ownership transfers? But this next language that's being struck, so long as all of such land is contiguous, except for any streets or driveways separating the land, I think that the intent here is, regardless of whether it's contiguous or not, if it's all part of the same site area, all part of the same site plan approval, then the provisions of the zoning code, the dimensional provisions of the zoning code, should continue to apply as they did in the site plan approval. So rather than have this carve out to potentially accept out whether the zoning regulations continue to apply the overall site area, we're saying, no, it should continue to apply to the overall site area regardless of any proviso about whether the land is contiguous, with the exception of
Yeah.
streets, et cetera.
My reading of
I think
the,
it's more protective of the city, actually, to have this language with the strikeouts.
strikeout?
Okay, and that's all making
Yeah,
sense, but then
yeah.
what doesn't make sense is, so is what you're saying that right now, if you somehow are doing some site plan where you're gonna subdivide, and after you subdivide, you're gonna have lots that are not, like maybe Fishkill Creek is running down the middle of it. I can't really think of anything else
Or,
that would,
Create a street.
or separate, or separate,
planning board
non-contiguous.
approval would no
Streets.
longer apply to that orphan
Think of it
piece
this
of
way.
land.
Think of it this way. Non-contiguous means separate, right? Not connected, right? So there is an instance where an owner could have a lot that they're subdividing into 3 parts and look to apply this provision to both parts on the side and not the middle one, therefore making it applicable to those 2 non-contiguous
Well,
parcels.
except it says all of such land is contiguous.
So what I'm saying is, in taking that out, it allows for what I just described to happen.
So the end result seems to make sense, but the beginning premise is so nonsensical. It makes me think we must not be interpreting this right in the first place, because I don't know why the city council
It was a constraint. It was a
acting with
constraint.
council
It
would,
was a constraint. It was a constraint that,
And,
is
constraints are used to control, right? So
unnecessary.
it's kind of like we don't want this to get out of hand, right? So
so then.
they're taking away that particular constraint for, I can only imagine, the kind of instance I just described, where you have one owner, it's an acre lot, whatever, they decide to divide it up into multiple lots for the purpose, right? And that they want to apply then this provision to parcel A, parcel B, and they happen to be non-contiguous. This would take away that constraint.
Well, yeah, it's just like I said, because it's using that all of such land is contiguous, even in that scenario where lots 1 and 3 no longer touch, all of such land is contiguous. So, all right, so let's just leave it at, it seems like this gets rid of some nonsensical language
Yeah,
that would lead
that's
to
my
absurd
sense.
results.
yeah, I
So
think that's the
then,
case.
the only other thing I wanted to say, because I'm not trying to monopolize the conversation, but I think this is the big picture issue, the real change that we're talking about making here is someone comes in, files a site plan for approval for a development, for whatever reason, decides, you know what, I want to do this in phases, and this opens up a door for them to basically go back and say, okay, now I want to do this instead of as the whole kit and caboodle was originally planned, now I want to do this in phases. What are the ramifications of making that change to our code?
Well, first of all, in order for them to do that, they need to come back to you. So you would have review and approval authority over that and would be able to set whatever controls, conditions, et cetera, would need to be in place in order to allow that phasing, if it were to proceed as requested, to be done in a way that is still going to be protective of the city and making sure that the important elements of the project that the city is looking for, like any community benefits, let's say like a greenway trail, right? To make sure that that greenway trail is still constructed at the
Yeah.
beginning part of the project versus at the end because
Yeah.
of a phasing or never gets constructed. So you have, because they're coming back to you for review of this, you have control over setting conditions and
I just think,
restrictions
I
for
just
that.
think about potential requirements that would be applicable to an application reviewed in whole as opposed to phased, that wouldn't necessarily be required for the first phase, for example, but would if it were considered as a whole. When does and again, this is a hypothetical, right? When would the requirements, as if reviewed as a whole, kick in? Is it phase 2? Is it phase 3? Or how do we kind of gauge that? You follow what I'm saying?
I'm sorry. I think
So
I lost you in the middle.
I'll try
I
to
apologize.
make this. So say a landowner or an owner's intent is to phase an approval, whether or not this mechanism it could apply, because I think there are precedents to our understanding certain owners wanting to phase projects. So for example, if you were to take that application, the plans of that owner in toto, and there are certain provisions that would need to be met, right, requirements, I don't know what they would be, so that's why this is a hypothetical. based on the in toto review,
Yeah.
is there some sort of skirting of those requirements based on the fact that they're just coming for this phase?
I don't
Right.
think so, because then if it becomes a phased project, you would have the ability to say, to craft when those phases occur, and maybe there's some elements that the applicant is putting in phase 4 that you don't agree with, you think that those elements should come up front
Yeah.
at phase 1 or phase 2. Like if there's, if you have a, let's say, a multifamily project, right, with 3 buildings.
Yeah.
And maybe most of the affordable units are being proposed to be constructed in phase 4.
That's a good example.
And you want, as the city, you want those affordable units to come online earlier than phase 4. You want them in phase 1 or phase 2.
Yeah.
So you would have the ability, as the applicant comes before you, to request this approval to mold that. Now, I want to go back for a second, because this doesn't necessarily only apply in a phased
Yeah, no,
project. It
understood.
could just be, that they're constructing everything all at the same time, but they have different financing needs.
That totally
Yeah.
understood, although I think the phasing part kind of comes in because we're talking about parcels within parcels, right?
Yeah.
It lends itself to
Yeah.
that being a, sort of a logical next.
If there's not some phasing going on,
Approach.
I don't know why they'd want to subject themselves to multiple reviews in front of the board anyway.
I think it's, again, I mean, I think an owner needs to be very cognizant of what it means for them in regards to the sequence of reviews, but there may be a benefit to them relative to the financing aspect, and that's
Yeah.
I think kind of why
So
this is being considered.
your comment got me thinking about something, or developing a thought I kind of had a little more, and it's this. One scenario here that could be concerning would be if pertinent zoning or building code provisions have changed since the initial site plan review was granted on what now someone is seeking to subdivide
that's
and
a good point,
convert
too.
to two-phase. And the possibility that by jumping onto this provision and saying, I've got vested rights under the prior scheme, we could basically get ourselves into a scenario we wouldn't want
That's a
to
good
be
question.
in.
I would
What if-
imagine the
what-
review would be subject to the laws in place at the time of the review, so they couldn't necessarily make an argument for, oh, the original phase was approved under this old
But-
law.
but this is
so
going back
therefore
into
you
that.
must, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. This is going back into that whole, there's a legal standard about when changes to building and zoning codes are made, and it
Yeah, I
basically has
understand.
to do with how far.
That's why you
down the
never
line
have to,
you've
you
gone.
never have to apologize for
Construction,
being an
typically
attorney.
foundations in the ground.
Yeah.
But now, on the other hand, to this tying directly into all of this, it might be worth considering adding language into here saying that if someone, in substance, if someone is converting something that started out as a single-phase application into a multi-phase application, that it needs to be an application that, I don't know the exact wordsmithing, but would have been approved under current guidelines or requirements
Current codes or laws,
under the
right?
current code.
Yeah.
Because one thing that would do too is that would, in that scenario we just laid out, I think one end result of that would be the applicant would no longer be in a position to say that if they were moving to two-phase permitting, they now could rely on a reasonable expectation that the prior statutory scheme would be in place, because we've got that in writing right there.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very good point. I think something we want to share with the council, yeah.
Yeah, I
one
think something
question.
to make sure that they're thinking about that. I do think that the original site plan approval continues to apply, though, for the whole project.
Yeah,
So all of
look at the two
original
examples.
conditions, all of
Edgewater
the-
was approved as a project at whole, 5 buildings, but it was built in 2 phases.
Yes.
3 buildings first, 2 buildings later. So the zoning that was in place applies to all 5 buildings. The approval is for all 5 buildings. Mirbeau, on the other hand, divided it into 2 phases in which there was one constructed and improved, another one conceptually approved. If that comes back and they want to do phase 2, that would have to be under the current zoning, even if it's changed since phase one.
If
Because
only
now they're
it's
doing a site
conceptual.
plan amendment
Yes.
for the first phase. So the zoning is attached to whatever approval is, the type of project that's set out to be in the beginning. So I don't think there's a real problem here.
Now, there are several instances this can apply to, and you can think of hypotheticals for Creek Drive, for Edgewater, and the open lots that are on, that were contemplated on Fishkill Avenue, right? What are the impact, and we should examine that. What's the impact of this change in law on future subdivisions and current subdivisions? There's an issue on Creek Drive where they have a commercial building that was required, and one of the questions I had was, does this allow them to subdivide and sell a parcel, right? And whose responsibility is it to complete that portion of their required, what was required in that application? It's
kind of different.
Revisit it.
This is different.
So even if that were to, let me just say, even if that were to happen, the obligations and the conditions on the original approval still apply regardless of who owns it.
What about the sequencing of the trails that are involved?
Still
apply.
applies
I mean, that's an
regardless
important
of
thing.
who
That's an important
the
part
owner
of
is. Yeah.
the public
That's what,
benefits.
when you look at your resolutions, it doesn't apply, the obligations in the resolution don't apply just to the applicant, but it's the applicant and its successors and assigns. So that includes subsequent property owners.
Yeah, it's a bit of a different scenario, but thanks for raising that, Kevin. But
Well,
by what,
The application you're talking about, I was on the zoning board when that was in front of us, and there's actually a more specific reason for that, which is in the FCD zoning code restrictions itself, there's an explicit condition saying that the C of O on the commercial space, or C of O will not be granted on commercial space until it's on the residential space. So this amendment would not impact that, because you've still got that express restriction there.
I mean, I just think it's important to explore in detail, or at least in the, as if this proposed law affects it, how, and any of the potential developments and the existing developments, and how it would play out in a number of different scenarios, even besides what's contemplated or proposed by the applicants, and what the worst case is, and that sort of thing. That's important.
Can anyone think of a reason that would be, a reason to deny such an application that might be, not, is there like a downside? And I guess sometimes with these things, I'm like, okay, so what is the, where are the teeth in this thing where we can say, hey, we're denying this application because, it doesn't meet these criteria, or
The downside is we don't think it's actually going to get built the way is expected under the zoning code. Somebody's going to get halfway done with the project, run out of money, declare bankruptcy, whatever, and 10 years later, we've got a half-done project.
yeah, that's somewhat out of our control.
That's what I was going to say. That's
Right.
as soon as you start talking about finance, I'm
That's-
like, oh no, that's something
Yeah.
that we can't even get into.
Yeah.
We don't
I
ever
think
seem
that's
to
what
have
this
any way.
is trying to avoid.
Right.
Right.
This-
But some of the
right.
arguments made, of course, involve
Is there
complaining
anything,
about financing,
Yeah.
and other things.
Is there any unforeseen scenario, for example, like where we have, say, a property that's got a historic building, or a landmark building status, and there's an application to do an internal subdivision because of financing, and then somehow it ends up, undermining the, sort of the status of the building. I don't really, I'm just trying to think of how does this come back and bite us? And how do we say no to it when we sense that it's going to happen, But is there any kind of downside we can foresee with that?
It's hard to game out all of the potential, unintended
Yeah,
consequences
I mean, I
and
think
stuff like
the
this,
other
but
thing to remember too is this law already exists
Right.
on your
But it
books,
just doesn't
right?
apply to
It
residential.
just doesn't apply to
Just doesn't apply to
residential.
residential.
Yeah, so
so,
But that's
not to
most-
say that that means the law should
all the
continue to exist.
Yeah, all the
right?
substantial projects are.
But it's been in
residential.
place since
But it's
'93.
It's been on your books for a
We've never
long
had
time.
a real problem based on it.
Right.
And all he's doing is saying, why should it only be commercial? It was probably put in place because some commercial developer asked for it back in 1993, and they didn't think ahead to say, well, why wouldn't you do this for residential as well?
yeah, so I think just in the interest of time, you make a valid point. It's something at least to point out to the council just to consider, just in relationship to, what, have they thought through whether, and it sounds like there isn't a problem, it's just since we've had this robust
Well,
discussion, let's
the particular
share that
que-
observation.
The particular question being, is it something that would have been approved as a two-phased application if they were putting it in now? Is there some reason, in other words, that, although I don't know,
Yeah.
is there actually any, I guess that's kind of what Lynn was getting
I think
at.
what we're
there's
getting
also-
at is the question is there any potential mechanism for a phased project to fall under different requirements based on the timing of laws in place
Yeah.
at the time? Something to that effect.
I think there was, in your presentation, there was also, I think I heard an inference that there could be some kind of negotiation for a public benefit in considering something like this, but I don't see that there's anything in the
Not-
law that
no.
would allow us to, I mean,
Just to
somebody
make
would
sure,
say,
no.
no, I'm not, all I'm asking is what's already in your law. I'm not getting, there's no,
The community
no trading
benefit
on this,
that I
you know.
referred to was if there's a community benefit like a greenway trail in the original approval, and someone comes in and asks for this subdivision, we want to make sure that that greenway trail isn't going to get pushed to the back
Yeah.
of the burner. That the obligations in the original site plan approval will remain, and that greenway trail will get constructed. That's just one example.
Yeah, no, that
that's
makes
all-
sense.
but
And then,
It's all gonna be based on the sort of fortitude and, of the planning board to enforce it. I mean, there's nothing in the.
Yes and no,
there's nothing
but
written
the
in the law that
original
says-
approval remains.
No, but
The
I'd like
site
to-
plan
I was gonna say,
approval
like-
remains, and all of the obligations and all of the conditions remain.
yeah, that's understood.
Yeah.
The other note is, I think, again, to your point, just a basis for understanding the history of the original law, for what it's worth. So I think, just again, in the interest of time, unless there's other, real pressing comments on this, it's pretty straightforward. We did want to potentially talk about the draft law in terms of parking standards, but timing on that?
Well, I think there's no time to talk about it tonight. What I would suggest is, we talked in the abstract about the idea of eliminating minimum parking standards and putting in maximum standards instead.
Yep.
So the council's asked me to do a first draft, so I've done that. If you want to look at it, it's in the November 6th city council agenda.
Are they planning to potentially act on it? November 6th? Oh, actually what you're saying, it's in.
Yeah,
It's in record,
they've
so
looked
we
at the
can look
first
at-
draft
Okay.
and made some comments. We're going to come back with a second draft. There's some questions.
Okay.
I'm not sure they're 100% sold on the idea, certain members, so it's nowhere near being adopted at this point.
Yeah, so that's why I asked the timing on it, not whether we
Yeah.
have time tonight, but
But
whether
we
we
can-
have time.
Yeah, we
before
can
they
talk about it
take
in
substantive
December if you
action.
want.
That's great.